Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I want to quickly go over my top 10 favorite books of all time. By any author, any genre, just my top 10 favorite books. This list is pretty hard to make just because a lot of my favorite books are in completely different genres. You got horror, you got fantasy, sci-fi, thriller, classics, and just fiction in general. So it's like, how do you compare them all? And on my phone, I saw, like a top 10 list that I made last year. And I looked back and I was like, okay, well, most of these books are pretty secure for this list, but I've recently read a handful of books that could potentially fit. So I've had to make some changes, and it just irks me that a lot of books are not on this list because obviously top 10, you can only have 10. It's also hard because you want to try to include a lot of your favorite authors in your top 10, but there's a lot of my favorite authors are not going to be on this list, like Michael Crichton, Haruki Murakami. Like, they're not on here at all. And speaking of authors, the only one rule for this top 10 list is one book per author, so it's not just full of George R. R. Martin and Stephen King books, because that would be boring. Anyway, let's jump right into it. And starting out with number 10, we have the book that's newest to me. I actually just read this book, I think it was like a week or two ago, but I instantly fell in love with it. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. As soon as I read this book, I knew instantly that this had to make my top 10. It was just so good. I've said this several times, but I love classic rock, and this book just, oh man, it scratched an itch for me. And that's pretty much the only reason that it's number 10 on the list so far, is just because it's so recent. I have a feeling that as time goes by and I reread this a couple times, that it's going to move higher on the list. But for right now, I think number 10 is a good spot. And number 9 on the list is another new entry. I read this book, I think either last year or maybe a year ago. It's by one of my all-time favorite authors now, Then She Was Gone by Lisa Jewell. This book, man, I've just never quite read a book told this way. Lisa Jewell structures her books in a very interesting way. You've got usually 3 characters that you follow through most of the book, and you get introduced to like how they are as a character, and you just she slowly weaves in plot information, and you don't really know quite what's going on until the end. And I just love just kind of the dark and gloomy atmosphere that she provides in all of her books, and all of her characters, even her major characters are great, but even her minor characters are just very intriguing. And I'm starting to realize this now, but this is the only, I think, mystery book I have in my top 10, so I guess this would make it my favorite mystery thriller kind of book ever. So that's high praise. And number 8 on the list is the first fantasy book entry into the list. And trust me, you'll see more as we go on. But for number 8, we have Sword of Destiny by Andrzej Sapkowski, the second short story collection in the Witcher series. I love fantasy, and I love like short stories and novellas, but you don't often see the two combined together. Usually when you're reading fantasy, you got these big epic tomes, right? And usually when you're reading like short stories or novellas, those tend to be more like mystery, thriller, horror types of stories. But I thought this was just brilliant. And I'm a huge fan of the Witcher series, but I will say that I think Andrzej Sapkowski is just an overall better short story and novella writer more so than a novel writer. And all of the stories in here just have really cool premises and just very cool payoffs as well. And number 7 on the list is Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. This is the first book in the Themis Files trilogy, which is my favorite trilogy of all time. And it's one of those deals where it's like, I love the trilogy as a whole, but like, this is my favorite in the series, so this is kind of like representing my love for the Themis Files. I love when books just go far and beyond to raise the stakes. And this book and the whole series, the whole trilogy as a whole, just the stakes are so high and the characters are so good. And that's another reason why I love this book. A lot of the times in sci-fi, the characters are kind of put on the back burner while the ideas and the scientific exploration is more in the forefront. But with this book, you've got a great balance of really cool sciencey stuff and you've got a lot of action, but Sylvain Neuvel takes the time to flesh out his characters. And number 6 on the list is yet another fantasy, probably the funniest book on the list, I would say. And we have The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch, the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series. This book used to be in my top 5 for a long time. I hesitate keeping it there though because I've only read it once, even though it's one of my favorite books. I've only read it once and it's been probably like 5 or 6 years since I've read it. I still remember a lot of it, but there's a good amount of details that I can't remember. And I love the series as a whole, so I really need to go back and reread the series, and hopefully the 4th book will come out soon. Who knows? Alright, now we're getting into my top 5 favorite books of all time. And for number 5, this might be a weird pick. A lot of people probably have never heard of this book, but it's very personal to me. It's Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. I first picked up this book in middle school after I joined band and started learning how to play percussion and drums. So the title itself was just extremely intriguing to me at the time as a little kid learning to play drums. And obviously from the title of the book, you expect it to be kind of a fun book, right? But you get a little bit ways into this book and it gets really depressing for like a middle school book, which just, when I read it back in middle school, it just came out of left field and I was like, what is happening? It basically follows this, middle school kid who's in jazz band and he's a really good drummer for his age, and he has this little brother who just won't stop pestering him all the time, like, get away from me, little brother. But then, you get a little bit ways into the book and you find out the little brother has leukemia and he has a pretty good chance of dying, and you're like, man, this is pretty heavy. And basically the book is essentially just a coming of age story. He's trying to realize that, look, I'm not the center of the universe. Like, there's more important things to life than just myself and my needs. I sometimes need to put the needs of other people first, like my dying brother. And it's the book that I've reread the most in my life. I've read it when I was in middle school, when I was in high school, when I was in college, and then I read it again when I was out of college. I've read it like 4 or 5 times in my life, and just, it's meant something different to me every time I've read it. And it's a book that I know I'll be rereading again and again far into the future. Easily a top 5 favorite book for me. And for number 4 on the list, again, this is one of my favorite authors of all time, and this is my favorite book by him. It would be The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. This is by far my favorite short story collection I've ever read. I think I've read it twice at this point, and usually when you get a short story collection, you're anticipating, at least some of the stories to be great, but you probably know that some of them are going to be fine, some of them are going to be bad, some of them you're just not going to like. But for me, I think there's about 18 in here. They're all great. And I implore anyone who's only ever read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury and has not read anything else by him, go pick up this book. It's fantastic. Please. And my third favorite book of all time is by my second favorite author, and it's a little hard to only choose one book for this top 10 list, but if I had to pick one, it would be The Dead Zone by Stephen King. I don't think people would argue that it's one of his best. I think a lot of people do like it, but to go as far as to say that it's his best or it's my favorite, that might be a stretch for a lot of people. For me, though, I read this book very early on in my King reading career. I read this book all the way back in 2013, 2014, and it's actually one of the very few King books that I hadn't seen the movie of. So a lot of this book, I had no idea what was going to happen. So it was super fresh to me. Whereas, if I read The Shining, or if I read Misery, or if I read Cujo, I know what's going to happen. And it's also one of those books where just everything feels super real to me. Sometimes you'll read a book, and it's good, and maybe even great, but it can be kind of hard to picture everything. With this book, just everything was super clear in my mind as to what was going on and where it was. And it almost felt really real to me, which is what a great book should be able to do. I'm actually a little scared to reread it because it's been so long. I've only read this book once, and it's been so long since I've read it. I'm afraid that I'm not going to like it as much the second time. So, oh man, I obviously will reread it, but man, because a book that I have read twice is Misery, and I love that book. So, if I read this and I don't like it quite as much, I'd have to switch the two out, right? And my second favorite book of all time is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. There's not much to say about this book that hasn't already been said. I've read this book twice now, and even though it's a thick book and it's 1,200 pages, it's still immaculately paced, which doesn't really make sense, right? But even though it's super long, everything feels super necessary, either to complement the world building, the character development, or to further the plot. Everything in here is just terrific. And it's one of those books that, like I said, I've read it twice. I reread it last year, and just going back and seeing the characters start their journey and just to get reintroduced to the world of Roshar again, it was so good. And my number one all-time favorite book of any genre, by any author, by any whatever, is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. It's my favorite book in my favorite series by my favorite author. it's hard to pick anything above this. And as far as why it's my favorite in the series, there's just so many great standout moments, and I won't spoil anything in this video, but just it seems like every chapter in this book, something exciting is happening or something game-changing is happening. There's so many deaths in this book and just so many just mind-blowing scenes, and just the epilogue of this book, which is not in the show. The first time I read it, anyway, what did you guys think of my list? Were there books in here that you absolutely love? Were there books in here that you despise? What are your top 10 favorite books of all time? I want to know, and please put them down in the comments below. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.